is a contrivance and an illusion, and he does it from the perspective of his own specialty in clinical psychology. And then I have two class exercises following on from the material to try and draw you out a bit. This time round, I'm asking the lecturers, Siddharth, whoever else, to be a human rights commission, okay, to give objective advice, impartial advice. And we're introducing a bill in Parliament, as we'll see, and this will be the government defending the bill. You can decide who the minister is for today, and this will be the opposition. You can decide who the leader of the opposition is. So there's two class exercises, and what we're going to do is switch around then for the second exercise, because then you'll be the government and you'll be the opposition. Change minister. Ministers change every so often. Change minister. So apologies for the fact that the material was quite dense, but at least as an introduction to the subject. And as you've seen, Americans love footnotes, so there's copious amounts of references and citations for you to follow up with. What am I using here? Am I using this or this? This? Okay, it's this. Trial by error. Oh yeah. Where we've come from so far is a look at the biological empirical question of who counts as a human, noting the variety of criteria that one might use. And biologists themselves are not hung up on cognition as actually the essence of what it means to be a human. Then we move to the more normative consideration, at least within ethics, not within law, we haven't even arrived at law yet, about who is morally considerable, who has quote-unquote full moral status, with a debate about are there any lesser forms of status, and the intriguing question mark left over toward the end of the course, could there be a higher status than regular human personhood? And we saw that that's important because then you're admitted into the moral community from the perspective of ethics, and it is only when you're acknowledged as part of the moral community that the moral community has obligations toward you, principally not to interfere, to let you do your own thing. I always call this the Woodstock theory of liberty, let your hair fall down, whatever you want to do. To come to your aid, at least on occasion, and to treat you fairly and equally. Although equality itself is a highly relativistic term, there are many different theories of equality. You know that well here in India. And we have colleagues who are developing what they call multi-dimensional disadvantage theories of equality, but I won't bore you with that. So the end result is, if you're in, you win. And once you're in, you are considered a free moral agent. You can do what you like. And remember we said, one of the critically important things is you have a right to do wrong. It's your freedom, it's your choice. And of course, if you do wrong that harms yourself, you're tough luck. If you do wrong that harms others, on occasion you'll be called to account, presumably through the legal system, for that. There's a certain dignity of risk, therefore, attaching to this, that we afford to every moral agent, every person. Of course, that dignity of risk has been denied to many different groups and many different persons throughout legal history, and it still is denied to, let's say, people with mental illness and people with intellectual disabilities. They too don't have an equal dignity of risk compared to yourself, right? Even though, if you're like me, you make lots of mistakes and you keep making the same bloody mistakes all over again. It's not as if we actually learn from our mistakes. Most of us don't, and the clinical psychologists are clear on that. So in legal terms, therefore, and you can look at law as just a tool, as just the epiphenomena, just the end result of all of this. The law then copper fastens into place the rights and privileges of moral agents. Gives you freedoms to do this, liberty to do that, privileges to do the other. And if somebody comes to court and says, you're not a person, you don't have these rights, so, no, I'm due equal recognition before the law as a person, and also equal protection of the law to create me that breathing space, that living space to do my own thing, to make my own legal universe. This is the interesting contrast between the feudal legal system and, for want of a better expression, the liberal democratic legal system. But whereas feudalism and what preceded feudalism favored a theory of the good, that we know what the ultimate good of society is and the ultimate good of persons is, there's no space for you to innovate and to express yourself differently. Whereas a theory of the right suggests that the ideal political arrangement is the one that allows you to decide for yourself what your theory of the good is, and then to implement it in your own life accordingly, without cross-contamination from others. Of course, we're all influenced by our parents and our culture and our surroundings, but at least theoretically, we become, and this is the spatial image, the masterless man, owing no obligations to anybody, navigating the life world in a newly imagined civil society which didn't exist during the period before the Enlightenment and so forth. So that's basically it. That's kind of the logic train that we follow, and that's what we're trying to critique and unravel. So just breaking it apart a little bit more, obviously before we're in this world, our genetic makeup is determined by our parents and so forth. We do have a brain, and we do have a mind, and of course the debate rages on as to whether the two are the same, whether the mind is wholly distinct from the brain, or whether it's fully or partially determined by brain functioning. You'd be amazed to see how many people actually still dispute that one today. For example, the guy we're going to watch on video, hopefully if it works, maintains that the mind is basically an illusion, that it's basically dependent on the functions of the brain. He doesn't mean to say that the illusion isn't real. Of course it's real, but nevertheless it's a contrivance, it's a fabrication. It's not something that has an objective ontological existence. And he's opposed, his name is Bruce Hood. If you just Google Bruce Hood, you'll find loads of stuff written by him. His recent book is just called The Social Brain, right? He's opposed by Mary Midgley in Oxford University, who has written a book called Are You an Illusion? And the answer she posits is no, of course you're not an illusion, and that the mind has a separate existence from the brain. I don't want to get into that, but I just want to make you aware of that distinction and that thing. And Bruce Hood actually says the self is an illusion. Your conception of selfhood is really an illusion. It's not an objective reality or an objective existence, which is quite corrosive of personhood and what we're trying to achieve through the legal conception of personhood. We've seen, but this is largely derived from the criteria on who is a human, that you can break that down into many different indicia, criteria, whatever you want to call it. This guy is well worth having a read of. Although I have to say, and students will hate this, it's a huge book. It's like 400 or 500 pages. And the very title gives it away. It's called Sources of Self. This book is out, I don't know, 4 or 5 years. And if you go on YouTube, you'll find lots of interviews with him on this particular book. And basically, he thinks the self is real, but he contextualizes it by bringing into the train a lot of the conditioning variables, such as social circumstances, cultural circumstances, and so forth. I know I'm digressing, but I just want to give the big picture so that you can go off on a frolic of your own and do your own research. By the way, at least one of you have come to me so far on thesis, so anybody else wants to come, I'd love to hear you. Okay, to today's topic. Evolution. Obviously, you know who this guy is, Charles Darwin. His book, The Origin of the Species, he kept it in his back drawer for about 12 or 14 years because he was personally shocked at the implications of his own book. He was a practicing, I think it was a Methodist, very, very committed to his local church, and was really scratching his head over, could I really have meant that? Is this really what I'm trying to say? And the only reason he published it quickly, hurriedly, it was because a rival was about to publish pretty much the same thing. So he was very hesitant about how his theories might be abused. Very hesitant that it might be drawn to a certain logical direction, and he felt really uncomfortable with that himself. This guy, Richard Dawkins, wrote The Selfish Gene in, I think it's the 1970s, which was a landmark publication, and I'll explain why momentarily. I couldn't resist putting in this graphic which shows the evolution of man to reading your mobile phone, your smartphone and so forth. Is that really evolution? I'm not quite sure. So, and this is E.O. Wilson, Edward Wilson at Harvard University, whose main field of study is ants, ant colonies, how ants behave, how they almost behave as if they, if anyone follows Star Trek, as if they're the Borg, as if they're a collective. So the unit of moral agency is the collective. It's not the individual, so to speak. By the way, there's very interesting debates on whether groups can be units of moral agency. And a lot of people in the 70s and the 80s were applying that to Germany, whether Germans of today have some collective moral responsibility for what happened in the 1930s and the 1940s. Very interesting subfield in and of itself. So he's kind of like the father of sociobiology. He said, nature holds the key to our aesthetic, intellectual, cognitive, and even spiritual satisfaction. So I think Darwin would probably be a bit shocked at this kind of extrapolation of Darwinism. And he's still active, and in fact, if you go on YouTube, again, you'll find a lot of interviews with Edward Wilson on the nature of sociobiology. He's lately turned his attention to the future of the planet as an ecosystem and the diversity of animals and plant life on the planet and so forth. I have to mention this guy. His book you have here, the second book. The first book is quite amazing, and it's like a variation of a theme on Darwinism, social Darwinism, although he doesn't describe it like that himself. He asks himself, well, he puts a very straightforward question. If you were on an island with a chimpanzee, who's going to survive? And the answer is a chimpanzee, hands down, right? Because it can manipulate nature much quicker than you can at this stage because of human evolution. And therefore, why did we succeed in commanding the planet, so to speak, over the last 300 or 400 years? And he actually goes back even further than that. He goes back several thousand years. It's amazing. You have a history of the world in about 200 pages. And his answer is very simple. His answer has to do with rudimentary cognitive ability that evolved in the brain earlier on with humans, and then the evolution of language, which meant that we could cooperate, we could imagine things that don't exist. And if you living in India and I living in Ireland could both subscribe to that, we could both work toward it. So you can't imagine a lion or a tiger or a chimpanzee communicating on the internet with chimpanzees in Japan, having the same objects and purposes, and then will to actually succeed. So it's this possibility of creating imagined realities and to communicate them, to motivate each other, and to coordinate our activity. That's what distinguishes the humans from other species. So he calls human rights an imagined reality, something that doesn't have an objective existence, although something capable of motivating, hopefully, all of us. Likewise, he calls religion an imagined reality and got into a lot of trouble for that. Absolutely fascinating piece of work, and it's only in the last part of that book that he talks about now the tables are turned. Now we can use technology to actually change our own nature, perhaps accelerate certain things within our nature, perhaps de-emphasize other things within our nature, which is why he wrote the second book, which you have before you. So I just thought I'd bring him into the frame. So Darwinism was, a lot of the original propagators of it did not apply it to human society. They applied it to other kinds of animals and plants to try and understand how they evolved the way they did. But gradually, of course, it was inevitable that it would be applied to human society, human evolution. To explain human evolution, perhaps give some parameters on the outer limits of human evolution. So it comes under a lot of titles and headings and subfields and subdisciplines. For example, behavioral Darwinism, sociobiology is probably the one by which it's most known today. Evolutionary psychology is a branch of psychology, but a branch that deals with the actual evolution of the human mind, the human brain, or the two together if you think they're fused. What's the essence of it? I think when you peel it away, it's pretty straightforward and pretty simple, right? You take a gene, or a pool of genes, and then you take the person. The pool of genes is primary. The person is secondary. The person is only a carrier. The person is only a means by which the genes propagates itself into the future. That's why Dawkins calls it the selfish gene. It doesn't care about the person, right? So long as the person succeeds in propagating the genes into the future, that's what counts. So to be here another day, to be in the frame, and to propagate yourself through platforms which happen to take the humanoid form, that's the game, right? And so essentially the person is kind of just a conduit, and the genes have reasons of their own to propagate into the future. Let's see. Oh, sorry, let me go back. And then it moves on, okay? Now, if you're propagating into the future, by the way, they're now suggesting that all of our organs begin to shut down at the age of 26, 27. And the evolutionary psychology or the sociobiology explanation of that is job done, right? You've probably reproduced by that age. There really is no reason anymore to actually keep you living. And they've discovered the gene that turns the key off. And what they're now trying to do is to reverse that and keep the key turned on, which is the key to longer lifespan and so forth. So it's quite fascinating. 10 years ago they used to say it was 37. Now they're saying it's 27. You're done. And also it's very interesting. I know I'm jumping ahead here to the whole field of ethics and what the hell is the whole field of ethics. They say that, sociobiologists say, that you feel an innate obligation, a very intense obligation toward those who are closest to you. Obviously your wife, if you're male, your husband if you're female, but your children as well. So, and there's a reason for that. So from sociobiological terms, the reason is the genes wants its genes to succeed and continue. We're relatively uninterested in carriers, namely humans, who have other genes because they're not our genes, right? And they're using that to explain why the intensity of the obligation to, for example, save your children in a fire instead of the neighbors in a fire is actually there. We'll come back to that later on when we talk about altruism. So you thought you were primary, right? You thought your sense of self was where it's at. You thought that you can do your own thing, make it your own way in life, but in actual fact, the tail is wagging the dog, and you're the dog here, and the tail is much more powerful than the dog, and most of your impulses come from this, right? I was reading recently a little article in one of the newspapers about road rage, and they reckon it's the older, more primitive side of your brain, your mind, if you want to call it that, the reptilian part, that's engaged when you're driving. That's why you put the fist out the window, you tell people to get away, and there's so many accidents caused by that. So it's not as if we're cognitively thinking, oh, was that a reasonable move there at the light? No, it's not the way you're doing it. So I just wanted to show you this. I don't know if you're aware of C-SPAN, an amazing resource in the United States. If you go onto C-SPAN, it's just cspan.org. You'll get a fascinating series of lectures on eugenics, which in a way is just grasping at one social implication of an extreme version of sociobiology. This particular lecture by Robert Riedel is well worth watching, because obviously you have genes, but then you have gene pools within nations or within parts of nations, and then that leads to, or maybe it shouldn't lead to, but others think it leads to, the perception that some gene pools are better than others. Some have to be suppressed, some have to be given more breathing space, which gets you into the whole field of eugenics. And eugenics wasn't just a Nazi invention. It was very popular right throughout Europe and the United States 100 years ago. And the slogan they used was "Fitter families for future firesides." Okay? And in fact, they had a whole exhibition at the World Fair around 1910, I think it was in Chicago, on exactly this, how we can actually, through more selective breeding, actually get the balance right and improve the stock. This was the language they actually used at the time, improve the stock. No accident that Heinrich Himmler in the SS, in a previous life, was a chicken farmer who was an expert in breeding chicken stock. And what he basically did, very simple, is he applied that insight and knowledge to humans. And that explains a lot about the Holocaust and a lot about the extermination of people with disabilities and even alcoholics. They targeted alcoholics as well in their earlier periods. I mean, that's a more extreme version of eugenics. Mostly eugenics is about selective breeding. For example, denying members of one group to intermarry with another group and so forth. And there's a recent report. It'd be lovely if somebody did an essay on this. Sorry, it's not there. Oops, I go back to it. It's here somewhere. By the WHO, the World Health Organization, about 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, on sterilization around the world, by which they meant compulsory sterilization over which the individual had no knowledge. And a lot of the sterilization that happens today is without the knowledge, much less the consent of the women involved. And it's nearly always women, it's not men, although men could be sterilized as well. So I have an image of it and I'll show it to you shortly. Very interesting piece of work. So, the way it happens is quite beyond me because I'm a lawyer, but I'm told the way it happens is that genes essentially coordinate with other genes and compete with still other genes in order to ensure that out of the infinite variation, something similar to them propagates into the future. And if they succeed in continually propagating, then that becomes a dominant strain within the gene pool, and if they don't, they don't. Okay? And it's quite fascinating to me that the scientists now do genetic mapping of populations. They can actually tell where you came from originally to go right back to the original gene that set up your family, for example. That's interesting to me because in genetic mapping of our population, the Irish are not a Celtic nation genetically speaking. This is proven beyond doubt from a genetic point of view. Culturally maybe, but genetically no. Allegedly we're closer to the Basques in northern Spain, and they in turn are close to the Georgians, not the Georgians in the US, but the Georgians to Russia, which is actually a country I really love. But it'll be fascinating to see that applied in India, to see where all your different peoples came from. So effectively you end up with survival of the fittest, meaning that configuration of genes that can make it in contemporary reality, that can survive into the future and propagate into the future. Remember now, you're irrelevant. You're just the carrier, right? The genes are what's driving all of this into the future. So, and our problem is that the preponderance of our genetic makeup was determined eons ago when we were hunter-gatherers, right? I love the image of these guys, at the big clubs out there in the caves and so forth. And the genes that made it at that point in time, that are still dominant in us today, even though our society is utterly unrecognizable today, is genes that predispose human behavior towards survival, meaning aggression. Aggression is a normal part of the human condition, regrettably so. You see it on the road when you're driving in Hyderabad, right? It has predisposed us toward kith and kin, which emphasizes loyalty to our tight-knit group. Flip that over, xenophobia is a very natural part of the human condition, and in the wrong hands, particularly lazy and negative politicians, can be turned on like that. It's so easy. Just look at some countries in Central Europe today. Allied to that is when you encounter the other, your natural presumption is they're going to be disloyal. Your natural presumption is they don't belong. Your natural presumption is they might be a danger to the integrity of the gene pool, okay? And these are the genes talking. It's not you talking. Well, I mean, you are talking, but you're the mouthpiece for the genes, let's put it that way. Also, one thing that emphasizes territoriality, that it's not just people, it's people and place. And those two things together are quite important, and people fabricate their collective identity relative to place. I don't know about India, I suspect it's the same in India, but in Ireland we have a very clear map imagery of the country. I imagine it's the same in India, okay? And that means possessiveness, that's putting it at its mildest, okay? It could mean exclusion, let's say exclusion of refugees or exclusion of the other, and so forth. And selfish altruism is also at play. In other words, if there's a fire in the building, I'm going to rescue my kids before I rescue any one of you, because I have a better chance of my genes propagating into the future than if I rescue you, even though you might have better genes. Come here to my kids, okay? So the point is that human behavior has certain dispositions, and when push comes to shove, when you're really in a tight spot, this is how you react, almost without thinking. Thinking has nothing to do with it. It's the genes that are acting here. It's not necessarily you, yourself, or your personhood that's actually center stage. Now, okay, that helps explain a lot of things. Perhaps it explains the field of ethics. Perhaps it just provides a background explanation to ethics, and ethics has its own bottom, so to speak. We like to think that ethics is impartial, independent, objective, applies to everybody, but some would say that it's dependent on, maybe not vitally dependent on, but it's largely dependent on these ingrained human dispositions. So, for example, our ethical obligations toward one another in situations of difficulty, the ethicists do make differences between kith and kin and others. Let me come back to that momentarily because it's a hot topic. So, you get it, I just thought I'd throw in a cartoon there. That's the WH report of about 2.5 years ago. Very, very, very interesting report. If anybody wants to study it, I'll certainly help you do that. Okay, just to give you a bit of an explanation on some of the terminology. And this is terminology that the sociobiologists themselves use. You have your genotype, which is the particular mix of genes in your gene pool. You have your phenotype, which is how these genes interact with the environment around you. Interacting with the Indian environment is different to interacting with the Irish environment. For one thing, it's much more hot here than it is in Ireland, but also culturally, also in terms of your traditions and so forth. And then there's the epigenetic phenomena, which has to do with your purely personal experiences. All of these three things combined get to make up who you are. And most of the sociobiologists don't say that you're utterly, totally, and completely driven by your genetic dispositions, that these other things also play a part. And indeed, your own nurturing, as it were, is as important as the nature that you inherit. That's not to say that nurture is vitally determinative, because hopefully, this is the big question we discuss, something left of yourself. There's something left of the actual inner spark of you as a person that can say, hang on a minute now, I know I want to kill that guy who just cut in on front of me, I really shouldn't do it. Hopefully you say that to yourself. This is one of the really interesting concepts that sociobiologists talk a lot about, which is reciprocal altruism. And Robert Wright in particular uses it to try and explain or even explain away the whole field of ethics. Okay? That is the idea that I have altruistic urges, not just toward those who are very close to me, to make sure the gene pool extends into the future, but also towards strangers on occasion. Why? Because I might need their cooperation in the future. I might need to be able to dip into their gene pool in order to improve my gene pool in the future. And if I extend myself and help them out, possibly in the future they will extend themselves and help me out. Of course, you're never going to get 100% return, but 50% might be enough to ensure that your gene pool can expand and enrich itself through other gene pools. So Robert Wright and others explains this well-known phenomenon of reciprocal altruism in human behavior to explain why we owe obligations to each other. Remember in the Bible, you may not have read the Bible, that Jesus asks, who is my neighbor? My neighbor is everybody, and I have obligations toward everybody. This is the book here, The Moral Animal. The book of Edward Wilson was The Human Animal. So now Wright calls it the moral animal. Why we are the way we are, the new science of evolutionary psychology, which he uses to explain the whole field of ethics. Very, very challenging work indeed. So, you saw in the literature the vexed debate about what's called the naturalistic fallacy. The fallacy that what exists is what ought to exist. That you can imply a moral value from a bare empirical reality that you expose in examination or literature or whatnot. I'm not going to go into as many great details, save to say that people like Edward Wilson and Robert Wright don't necessarily subscribe to the view that sociobiology, the reality of our human dispositions, our genetic makeup, is all there is to the field of ethics. There's something else, but they also say it helps explain why the field of ethics takes certain turns. For example, why is the field of ethics confined to humans? Why don't we have a field of ethics applied to different creatures, like animals or plants? Now, I know it is evolving and is happening, but at least way back in the 1970s and 80s, you didn't. Why the speciesism? Why the privileging of the human species over other species? Well, it's obvious. We're the genes who want to advance. We don't care about elephant genes or tiger genes, right? Okay, I move forward. I'll leave that because that's just detail. What I want to do now is show the movie. I can show the movie. And then give you 2 class tasks. Okay. Let me give you a sneak preview as to what one of your exercises is going to be. Okay. An act to calibrate rights, in other words, reduce rights, toward the morally irresponsible, toward those who have bad genes. And we can detect this through genetic testing. You get genetic testing kits in the supermarket for $30 these days. Proposing to curtail the freedoms of certain classes of the genetically poor, that is to say those predisposed toward violence, as well as those brought up in extremely deprived backgrounds with no discernible moral code. Now I know that's freighted with a lot of assumptions. To deny them the right to marry, because it's likely that they will engage in violence in marriage, and to deny them certain other civil liberties as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Siddharth to be the Human Rights Commission to give some advisory opinion on this legislation. The minister here is going to introduce it, hopefully from a socio-biological point of view, and the opposition here will condemn it, using your own arguments and your own reasons. But let me show the movie first, because this is quite interesting in terms of a clinical psychologist attacking the idea that the self exists. I would play my accordion now if I have it, for the interlude, but I don't have it. Sitar, sorry. So one of our evolutionary problems is that this set of predispositions obviously doesn't fit the kind of culture and society we have today. Arguably, that's what makes transhumanism interesting, because we might leap ahead of that particular evolutionary plateau and reach a different kind of plateau. Okay. Hopefully the sound works as well. You see now, if this technology were embedded in us, it would be so simple, or just commanded to go on. Although I wouldn't want to swallow my laptop. Oh. Where do I see? Okay. Yeah. Just give me a sec. So the legislation denies to genetically poor people, that is to say people who are over-disposed toward violence, and let's imagine we can test for this, the right to marry, to deny them access to certain occupations like caring occupations, and to incentivize them to join the military. India needs these guys in the military. So this is the act, this is the proposed act, this is the government, this is the opposition. Let's cut right down here. And yeah. remember I said one of the first things to go either in sociobiology or in transhumanism is equality, right? So if you take that leap into the next paradigm, you're not worried about human equality. Because I'm putting arguments in the government's mouth here. Yeah. Let's see if we can show this. I don't know about India, but there's a lot of problems of domestic violence in marriage in Europe. If you can solve it, hey, solve it. Is it working? move the exercise